All right, what's up YouTube? So today we're going to talk about this idea of propagation and distribution. And this all ties into all the previous episodes about language and synesthesia and perception and sameness and difference and sameness. It all sort of ties together. So think about you're going from point A to point B, right? Let's just say you're even in one single room. You're going from one end of the room to the other, or maybe you're going from one room to another. Let's say you're going from your dorm room to the cafeteria, your dorm room to a class. Maybe you're going from a grocery store to a friend's house or something like that, right? Well, how do you actually tell what's going on? Because the frames are constantly changing. And now we can get into another rabbit hole about things that aren't changing and invariant and how that relates to compression and abstraction. But for sake of this point, things are basically almost always changing. But in order to that previous point, to perceive that there's anything happening, there has to be a sameness, an invariance, something that's remaining still, that's not changing. That's your sort of ultimate reference point. And so when you think about changes, photographic frames, and they're counting through, creating this illusion of motion. Let's just say you're going from one room to another. If it's a completely foreign, freshly born cognitive system that's learning everything for the first time, it's going to see things as pretty different each time. They're iterations. It's not going to necessarily be able to tell how similar these things are, only to a slight degree. And so a thought experiment for this would be similar to that thing that I explained in the last video about these distance and abstractions and perception of, say, visual arts, right? Where you have a very detailed thing that's very close to the reference, and then something that's just so much detail is removed and compressed and abstracted away that it goes from something like a photograph or a Mona Lisa to a Picasso or a Jackson Pollock, right? Think about it as it relates to motion and change, right? Because it's all kind of talking about the same thing. So it'll be easier to tell the difference if somebody is wearing the same outfit, the lighting is the same, all these types of things, right? And this is also very similar to when we train computer vision, right? And in AI. The difficult part is what happens when both those frames of reference are changing, right? It's this idea of moving metrics. If both of those things are constantly changing, it becomes significantly harder to tell what's going on. One of the things when I used to think about this, I realized that process of, let's just say you're going from room A to room B, C, D, E, F, G, so on. The lighting is constantly changing. You're changing in size and dimension and all that type of stuff. Your height is increasing. If you're getting older, you may be getting skinnier or chubbier or whatever. And your hair changes, your skin changes, all these things are changing. And it's like, well, that looks like the aging process. That looks like, what happens if you were to take somebody's life and compress it in a video frame, right? That's technically exactly what it is when you mess with those scales of time and the way it's perceived, because perhaps there's something about this way that things remain continuous amongst discontinuity. That's maybe a key to understanding what cognition and these complex systems are actually doing, right? And so, for instance, by saying that there's even, a difference, right, between point A and point B of age or whatever, or going from one room to another, and all these conditions are changing, they still have to be categorized in the same way to even tell the difference, right? And an analogy I can maybe give you for that is, let's say you have an object in the background, right? It could be that black square, white square thing that I said before. You'd only be able, if it's just those two things alone, completely isolated as much as possible and reduced. Like, those are the only ways you're going to be able to refer to any of those things that you're perceiving: the black from the white from the black, the background from the object from the background. That's the same thing with how we perceive motion, right? If I have, an object in a background, from the perspective of the object, it'll feel like the background is moving. From the perspective of the background, well, it'll seem like the object's moving. But here's the tricky part. If you were to intersect both of those perspectives, it would seem that nothing is moving. So once again, this idea of sameness and difference and sameness pops up again. I should probably come up with a cool name for that. I have a couple ideas, but it's kind of interesting that you sort of see this principle everywhere, which in a sense is kind of meta, because that's how I'm using it to explain things. But now I want to give this maybe a more grounded example, which is still a little out there, but maybe a little bit more understandable. Think about a plant. All right, let's just say your favorite fruit or vegetable. Maybe you really like berries or bananas or apples or whatever, right? Well, how does the thing actually propagate itself? How does it distribute itself from one point to another, from something that is itself to not itself? Well, in a very practical sense, the single unit doesn't actually do the reproducing or the propagation, because essentially I think of distribution, reproduction, as sort of the same thing, right, in a philosophical sense. And so when an apple or something is reproducing, the apple itself doesn't survive, right? It's relying on something almost, outside of itself to act as like a collective intelligence to go and propagate this aspect of it, right? So, what happens with a lot of plants is, okay, we'll eat the seeds or whatever, and they'll fall, or it comes out of us on the other end, and they're processed in various ways, and that's how they propagate. Well, if you think about, like, what has been at least as far as we know, the best way for plants to propagate, it was by being delicious and or nutritious to us, right? We love them so much that we can't help but produce the heck out of them, right? They're everywhere. And not only do we do that, but now we start catering it to our perspective and lens of processing that information. So like, it's this idea that either you change the environment or the environment changed you, but the trick is that they're always both happening in a sense. It's just what perspective you're taking. Now you can also think about this, you can actually technically apply this to everything, and I think this is a very, very deep philosophical concept of reality, this idea of sameness and difference, propagation, distribution, association, language, synesthesia, perception. I think these are all talking about the same things in a very abstract sense. And so, another way to think about this is with animals, right? So, for a lot of the population that will eat, chickens or pork or beef or whatever, well, those single animals are not surviving, and yet the collective is. So it's this sort of balance between the self and the non-self, but then it still technically is the self, right? Because you're attributing that category and that label and that identity to it, right? Yeah, that singular chicken that you just ate is no longer there, right? But the abstraction of it is still there. And it's sort of like, yeah, we can have, physically what seems like an identical cell between, if you and then me right here, but they're not actually physically the same thing. They're two different things in time and space, and it's only our compression of time and perception that lets us perceive and think that they're talking about the same things because it's an abstraction. Hope I'm explaining this right. This one might be a little rambly at times, but this is essentially the way that we categorize and label things in general, right? That's almost what the sameness in something is. And so when you think about what compression is, it's basically saying the things that don't change. If you have a frame of motion, right? Now think about this idea of the black and the white square, the background and the object, all these things. If you unify all the perspectives, nothing is actually technically moving, and nothing is leaving anywhere or going anywhere. It's actually the same. But by taking that perspective, it's almost a non-perspective because you're not able to do anything with it, right? A lot of the things that we do, back to that analogy of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The only way that we kind of do things is by taking a perspective, because if you don't have a perspective and you can't tell a difference in the sameness, then what can you tell? You can't tell anything. And so in a sense, if you think about plants and these animals and everything, yeah, the best thing they could have done was be delicious or nutritious to us, and now we breed the heck out of different fruits and vegetables and animals, right? The single unit doesn't exist, right, after we eat it or whatever. It's reprocessed in a different way. And yet the collective, the actual abstraction, the generalization, the category of it survives and thrives and keeps reproducing and building and distributing itself, right? And then the last thing I kind of wanted to touch on is this idea of something that's interior and exterior, right? By saying I'm taking something, distributing something to something that it isn't, by making that distribution alone, you're technically saying that it's under the same category. Right? You can't actually get out of that because, again, in order to say something is different, you have to say how they're the same. So in a sense, perspective, right, the limitation of the whole, a slice of the whole is kind of this idea of agency and intelligence, right? Because, you can't actually, if you're thinking about a room or these frames, you're not actually seeing them all at once. There's this process of compressing all of it, and then you can see it all in one frame, and that's also what we're doing in our visual frame, even just with something presented right in front of us. And I think that's an interesting idea of what agency and intelligence is. It's this idea of making a transition between one state to another and maintaining something, because that's how you actually identify it, right? From a certain perspective, you could say that, if I go from a circle, or a sphere to a chair or something like that, right? Like, depending on the capacity of the observer, which is also bounded by the environment in a sense, how is it going to be able to tell what the difference in the sameness is? Because if it can't tell that there's a similarity and there's an abstraction and a compression connection between them, then from that perspective, it will perceive that it is different or not connected, right? So this is also this illusion of continuity and causality almost. And actually on top of that, you could also say that that's sort of how perception and attention propagate and reproduce themselves. I mean, the act of attention is essentially distribution. The act of perception is distribution, right? When you're looking at one thing to another and you're able to see them and understand them in some context, that is that sameness and difference thing. By looking at the thing, you're automatically doing that. And that's also how we learn a language, or how we learn all these skills and do all this type of stuff. That's essentially what's happening. And I think it's kind of interesting that you could look at attention as an organism, right? It's an organism, it's a species, it's trying to propagate itself. And it's not using something external to itself to propagate. It is technically using itself by saying that it's propagating and changing. You're saying there's a sameness, there's a collective to it, right? You're saying that's shared. And yeah, I'll probably do a future video on this idea of perceptual and attentional organisms and the way that they propagate, right? Because that's also like what the social media game is. If you think of YouTube thumbnails and all this type of stuff, like they're caricatures of our attention. They're basically pretty much laying out the shape of our attention, with the exaggerated proportions and all those things and stuff like that. Like that's basically what it's doing. You could, if you were, say, not a human, or you had some slightly different attentional system or whatever, and if you were to look at that, that would be a good way of understanding the way our attentional and perceptual language is configured in a sense, right? And it would be interesting to see how that changes across people on the cognitive spectrum. So people that are, maybe on the autism spectrum, just people that are not neurotypical, people with lower or higher, fluid and, intelligence scores, or people, just in general in different states, if you're sleep deprived, if you're fully alert, if you're under some substance. I think we'd find some really interesting ideas about the actual, for lack of a better term, the invariant shape patterns of what perception and the perceptual language of that thing actually is. So, you can ask yourself if there's ever such a thing as truly exterior to a system, right? I mean, you can think about that in terms of how we talk about like reality. Like, can you actually say, if you're technically inside of reality, could you say what's outside of it? I mean, maybe you can, but also maybe not, right? And I think something to process a little bit more, right, is just think about, again, this idea of reproduction, of propagation and distribution. They're really talking about the same thing, right? And if you think about how do we distribute property from one thing to another, it's actually not going outside of itself, because by saying that they're distributed, you're actually saying that they fall under the same label or category or housing, right? So just, again, something to think about, the sameness and difference thing. Hope you found this kind of interesting. I'll probably do a little bit more of a technical video on this. I'm just going to open up. I'm trying to be a little bit experimental with this format and see what kind of catches and what people find to be useful. And I would definitely want to go into something a little bit more rigorously technical in the next month or so, or 2 months, just to see how things kind of marinate and how they're perceived. But that's it for now. Wishing everyone a happy holidays. Yo, I need you to do me a big favor. You gotta press that thumbs up looking button right now, or tap it or click it or whatever it. Do that. You're gonna be a good person if you do that. You'll be saving the world, I promise. You're gonna be a good person, people will like you more. Now you could press the other thing that looks like a thumb down, but people won't like you if you do that. You won't be beloved and cherished by all of humanity or AI. You could, it's your decision, you'll have to live with it, but it is better if you press the thumbs up button, the one that looks like this. Like, press that. Your life will be better, everyone's life will be better. And if you want to do something even better, actually, you should press the subscribe button. Or you press it, you tap it, you click it, whatever device you're using these days, do that. You'll be beloved by humanity even more. You'll be saving the world. And yeah, you should totally press that. It doesn't cost you anything. It's pretty easy. You've probably already done it a bunch of times anyways. Just do it. Like Nike says, just do it. And here is what looks like a coconut. I don't have anything deep or philosophical to say other than it's a coconut.